If you're the kind of senior engineer, architect, or technical leader who people look to for what's next, QCon London is probably on your radar. Join us in London from March 16th to the 19th, where we go deep on the topics that matter, like the architectures you've always wondered about, engineering productivity, and applying AI in the real world. This isn't about trends for their own sake. It's about getting practical insights from senior practitioners to help you make smarter calls on where to invest your time in tech. With software changing fast, QCon London is a conference that helps you lead the change. Learn more at qconlondon.com.
Hello everybody, I am Paul Impupop, an InfoQ editor, and I have in front of me Will McGugan, if I pronounce it correctly.
Not quite, it's McGugan, it's like double O.
Oh, okay.
But that was pretty close.
Let's give it another try. Will McGugan, right? Thank you for the first lesson of this recording, Will. And because it's just audio, Will has a very nice background with the Scottish colour behind him. And without further ado, I'll invite Will to introduce himself and tell us a bit of his upbringing. What brought him to computer science and coding?
So how did I get into computer science? Well, it goes all the way back to the 80s when I convinced my parents to purchase a ZX Spectrum 48K Plus, which was a large purchase in those days. But it was a computer that you could play games on, but you could also tinker with it. You could write BASIC and create little, very, very simple games, simple animations and things. And once I discovered this, I was hooked. It just seemed to be something that I liked to do. That's probably what got me into computer science, just playing around in my bedroom, making silly games and demos, which I'm kind of doing now.
Yeah, that's why I insisted on that, because it seems that stuck. And whoever says to kids that they don't use PCs except for gaming, they should let them do that, because games are quite complex stuff. And if they start writing that as well, it's important. But somewhere down the line, you stop playing games and you started tinkering with some other stuff. Still visually appealing, but a whole different thing. And that's TUI, or textual user interfaces. Or to be honest, there are two different tools that you put together, and both of them were in the same space. So the interaction to the terminal, one of them was TUI, and the other one was a CLI framework, if I get it correctly. Let's touch on that.
Yeah, the distinction is a bit kind of fuzzy. But yeah, so the first thing I built in this arena was Rich. And Rich is a library which writes nicely formatted content to the terminal. So it can be as simple as nicely wrapped text, but the text can have formatting, can have styles, bold, italic, can have colors, etc. And more advanced formatting like tables, panels, and widgets like scroll bars, status spinners, all sorts of things designed to make your terminal experience more pleasant. And people use that in CLIs, so a command line interface where you type something at the prompt and you get the output in your terminal. And that became quite popular. Rich could do some kind of animation type of things, like I mentioned, progress bars. And there's also a live update feature where you could refresh parts of the screen, and you could use that for things like dashboards. You could see CPU usage or messages coming in from a WebSocket or something. So it allowed developers to get visibility on their data, and they could build these apps relatively quickly. But as that became popular, people were asking for more interactive features. They wanted to click buttons, and they wanted to drag sliders, and they wanted content which could scroll up and down and you could navigate it with the cursor keys. And Textual didn't do that. It was never really intended to be that dynamic. Its purpose was just to create a nicely formatted output. But people kept on asking, and I saw people building these things using Rich plus number libraries to gather the input, and they could build interfaces. And I was starting to see how good it could be just with these people experimenting and creating cool things. I realized that the terminal could do much more. And I started building Textual. And Textual is a library which is designed to be more dynamic. it kind of uses Rich as the renderer. So Rich does the job of creating the colors and style and basic formatting. Textual takes the input, handles key presses, handles mouse movement, and it handles layout and lots of other features. But it builds on top of Rich to create fully dynamic interfaces that run inside your terminal. And those are typically called TUIs, text user interface. People recognize that term TUI. I've started moving away from it because I don't actually like it that much. I don't think it describes what textual is. Technically, it is built from text. There's recognizable text, there's letters, numbers, and digits, etc. But there's also borders and colors, and there's fading effects, and there's scroll bars. And these are built from text characters, even though they don't actually resemble text. So I think it's more accurate to call it a GUI, a graphical user interface. It's not great for doing highly detailed images, but in a sense it is graphical, because if you put a textual TUI next to a graphical interface, you see they look quite similar. They've got very similar components, buttons, scroll bars, text input, text area. So I think it's more accurate to refer to them as GUIs. They have a kind of a retro look and feel, but I think GUI is more accurate. But I won't correct you if anyone says TUI, because that's what I'm known for, and I can't by myself change nomenclature,
I will go with GUI, because for me, TUI makes me think about holidays, about the tour operator from Germany.
That's right, yeah.
Then it's better to just remain in this space and think about geeky stuff. Well, that seems like quite an interesting endeavor where you did need to do a bunch of stuff, and that probably was complicated and quite complex to build. So to just summarize, you started by saying that you can do more in terms of text in the CLI, so in the terminal, and that brought Rich to be implemented. And after that, seeing what people, geeks being geeks, and putting together different libraries together with Rich, what they managed to put together, you started building Textual, which actually uses Rich as the base for it, but it puts together all the other stuff. So actually Textual is more or less another framework for building GUIs, but with the dimension that it's considered on doing that retro feeling in the terminal and all the stuff that you normally see in browsers. So Textual, is it limited only to the terminal, or can it be used in other perspectives? Like, I don't know, what should happen if we just go and try to put something in the browser?
So Textual builds up an image essentially made from text, but the output doesn't necessarily have to be rendered by a terminal emulator. We have a feature called Textual Serve. Basically, it creates a web application that displays your terminal app inside the browser. The browser is essentially emulating a terminal, but you do get the same output. So if you've written a textual application, you can play with it and use it in your terminal emulator of choice, but you can also, with a single command line, serve it as a web application. And once it's a web application, of course, you can have anyone use it inside a browser. So you don't have to be terribly technical to use it. It's not like terminals are complex to use to run an app, but if you're not a technical person or you're not a software developer, you might not be familiar with terminals. So that's why I felt that the browser would give as many people as possible access to textual apps.
So Textual is actually doing the rendering into a given format, and it takes characters and just builds an image, this retro feeling. But you can have emulators, and there are terminal emulators, and there are multiple ways, multiple tools in that space. And then it's another way of doing it, and that makes it through a web server and makes it available in the browser. So if somebody would be crazy enough to put it, I don't know, in another space where they want to do it, actually you need to put an emulator in place. They have to implement an emulator, and then they should use Textual for the drawing side. Would that summarize?
Yeah, for now, the easiest way to get your textual app running somewhere else is to emulate a terminal. It's not quite the same thing as running a shell. If you have a textual app inside the browser, it's not like it's just giving you a remote shell. There's a little bit more going on there. There's a different protocol. It can do things like serving files. So if you have a file on your remote machine, you can download it via the browser. So it's not quite emulating a terminal. It's just using the same output that a terminal can consume. So as long as you have something which can render terminal output, which contains these kind of ANSI sequences, which impact the color and style, etc., then you can display a textual app. I've seen people do very strange things. Someone plugged in a textual app to one of these old school teleprinters, basically what the term TTY comes from, teletypewriter, and they could generate a textual app essentially on paper, which was hilarious to me that it actually worked because the protocol was designed decades ago, but it still works.
Oh, nice. Well, probably have to say now that they don't build them how they used to. So to just have a fair share of, nostalgia about past time, especially that the retro things are coming back in the scene. Okay, what will be a couple of lessons learned from your period of building textual? Because when you talk about that degree of finesse, of attention, of building a lot of stuff, you're talking about pixel perfect. It is not pixel perfect, but I would expect people to be very keen on seeing proper rendering and finesse. What would be a couple of things that you learned from this endeavor?
Well, it turned out to be much harder than I imagined. In retrospect, it should have been obvious. But the thing about writing for the terminal, especially if you're writing an application render, you get nothing for free. So if you were writing a web application, you've got such a lot from ground level. You've got buttons and text inputs, etc. In terminal, you don't have anything. The only primitives you really have are printing text and getting input. So it was a lot harder, but that was probably a good thing that I didn't know how hard it was going to be before I attempted it, because if I knew that from the start, I might never have done it. But other than that, I guess it's important to be creative. I find that I tend to like working on things that limit what you can do, and that actually helps you to be creative. The thing about building things for the browser is the browser can do almost anything. It's incredibly powerful, incredibly fast, and it's got a huge amount of scope. And it makes it hard to be creative for me because there's no guardrails. You can do absolutely anything. But in the terminal, because it is so limited, because you only have a certain number of tools at your disposal, it increases the amount of creativity because you have to be creative in order to do interesting things. Even basic things like render a button. How do you render something which looks like a button when all you've got is text? You haven't got shadows. You haven't got drop shadows. You haven't got rounded corners. So it forces you to be creative. And I think that's a great way to, if you want to be more creative, is to set limitations for yourself that will increase your creativity.
There is one thing that is just spinning in my head. So you mentioned a couple of things. You mentioned mouse, which back in the day was not on the same page or in the same landscape with the terminal. And then you mentioned buttons. So what's the dynamic of, okay, you're moving the mouse and then you want to press a button, and then what happens? You're just narrowing down and you see what's the position, and then actually you're trying to fire an event, or maybe just walk us briefly through it.
Yeah, so obviously the terminal emulator, its roots go back to teletypewriter, a thing which actually printed on paper. Of course, there was no concept of mouse there because it just couldn't exist. You can't point at the paper and then have the computer know where you're pointing. But they did add an additional protocol to terminals where you send the terminal sequence that says, please enable mouse reporting. And when that's enabled, it sends the mouse position encoded into standard input. So you can read that standard input and you can decode the mouse coordinates. It's not the easiest thing to do. You've got to do a bit of parsing, but it's fairly straightforward. But clicking a button, you would think that that would be simple, but there's no way in the terminal to ask it what's under the mouse. You know, if you've got a coordinate, you know that click happened at this coordinate. It won't tell you what's underneath, you know, what you clicked on, because the terminal has no notion what it's displaying. It's just displaying characters. And you can't even ask it what character is underneath this terminal. So in order to make a code button, you have to create a data structure in memory which describes where everything is positioned relative to the top, basically the coordinate of each widget. A widget is just a rectangle that does something. Button would be a widget. So when I read the mouse coordinates and the mouse button was clicked, I use this data structure to figure out exactly what was underneath the mouse when it was rendered. And once I've done that, I can send a message to the code that says button pressed and give it the coordinates. And then the application can decide how to respond to it. And the built-in button widget will also do some other things. Like when you click it, it'll highlight it. It'll just raise the color a little bit. And then after, I think it's 400 milliseconds, the color goes back to normal just to show that you've pressed it. It'll focus the button. It'll highlight it to show that you've navigated there. Because everything in Textual can work with the mouse or with the keyboard. You press tab to focus a button, or you can press it with a mouse. So quite a lot happens, but it has to be done in software. The terminal didn't really give you anything. You've got to handle all the positioning of widgets and detecting what's under a given coordinate in the code. And that's where a lot of the complexity goes in Textual. So you've got to write all that before you can put a single button on the screen. You've got to write a layout engine. You've got to write a parser. You've got to do a whole lot of work before you can turn the terminal into an application platform.
Okay, but you did the heavy lifting. So that's hidden, that's abstracted away. And how easy is it now to just build an interface using Textual?
Well, the Textual designed to hide away all the gory implementation details. If you're building an app, you don't want to care about these things. You just want to know, was my button pressed? So the code is fairly straightforward. Each widget has a message pump, which corresponds to a class. If you want to handle a button, you write a handler called onButtonPressed, and this gets called with a button pressed event when the user presses that button. And then you can fill in the code to respond to that button clicking. And the rest of it is like that. It boils it down to very simple message handlers, which happen in response to an outside event from the user. You fill in the code. And for the most part, you don't need to worry about any of the implementation details.
But unfortunately, that's a past endeavor, if I understand correctly. You decided to leave Textualize behind some time ago. And now you are using all the experience that you gathered to build something new. Talking about retro looks, people probably think that we're moving away from this AI thing, but actually you have an ace up your sleeve and you're currently building Toad, if I understand correctly. Can you just provide us more perspective of what Toad is?
So Toad, the name comes from textual code, which I squished together and turned into Toad. And what it is an interface for AI. So I'm sure a lot of people have used Claude CLI and Gemini CLI and a whole bunch of other applications that run in the terminal and allow you to do agentic coding. So you give it a prompt and it generates code for you. I think it's here to stay. I think we're going to be using it more in the future. But the terminal apps that we've been given they're not great. In fact, they're pretty poor. Even basic stuff like it can't update without flickering very unpleasantly. You can't interact with the output other than to type a prompt. You can't go back and highlight text and copy it because it will copy all these box drawing characters and hard line breaks and things. So all you've got is a prompt and some output, which is not very pleasant to look at. And I was looking at these kind of applications, and because I've been working in the terminal arena for such a long time, I knew that it could do so much better. Now, these are big tech companies with a lot of developers, a lot of smart people working from them, and they couldn't build good terminal apps that were user-friendly and visually appealing. And it was because they were using TypeScript, and that TypeScript doesn't have a very well developed any TUI libraries. They were using something which was more akin to Rich, which can generate nice output, but it's not dynamic at all. So I figured, well, I can do better. Not claiming to be smarter than any of these guys in big tech. It's just that I've had a head start. I've built Textual, and I have quite a lot of knowledge about terminals over the last 4 or 5 years of working. So I started building this interface to talk to Agentic AI that was more pleasant, more user-friendly to use. I was planning to build a protocol which would allow me to plug in a front end to something like Gemini, something like Claude, because I don't really want to get into the business of building an AI agent. But fortunately, after I started building on it, Z Industries, the people behind the Z, they came up with a protocol which does exactly what I needed. It's called Agent Client Protocol, and basically it allows a front end to plug into any AI agent. So I used that, and I built that layer, implemented that protocol, and that allows me to put my front end in Textual and Toad and plug it into any of these backends. So I have the ability to work with, I think it's about 8 different agents, and there's more of them coming online all the time. They all work in the same way. They all have different capabilities, but they talk to the front end in the same way. So now Toad can talk to all these different agents and give you nicely formatted text, beautiful streaming markdown. It's got a really nice diff view that looks as good as any kind of web view, and is just a really nice experience. And I'm very close to a release. Sometime in December, I'll release the first public version. It won't be a 1.0, but it'll be quite usable. And I'm quite excited for people to start playing with that.
Well, congratulations and best of luck to put it under the tree, right? Because we are still in the Western Hemisphere. But a couple of questions. What you're trying to put together is to create a terminal interface. And for me, it's quite funny because this all LLM insanity started with the browsers. And for me, it didn't make sense. You're doing something in the browser and then you just have to copy paste, and that usually doesn't work as expected, especially when you're working with a bunch of stuff. What I saw as a very good interaction was with Gemini, because they have all these places where you usually type and you write. So they have the Gmail, they have the Drive ecosystem, and then it made sense because it incorporated everything there where it's needed. What I didn't get is consistency and the ability or their limitation in terms of what to do. But that's a whole different story. And now we're discussing that people are moving towards the terminal. And actually, I am that kind of person because I have a bunch of discussions with my colleagues as well that why don't they use the terminal? Because you have the whole toolbox rather than just having a handful of tools that usually the UIs are providing. What you're focusing on is what you're very good at. And that's making simple into the terms of how they behave and the interaction with it. Because as you previously mentioned, it's quite complicated to get it to feel that simple for the user. But you keep aside the details of interacting with agents. You wanted to do the protocol, but actually it said, brought it up front in the probably is ACP, because everything is with CP nowadays, with MCP, ACP now with Agentic Context Protocol. But you still are able to interact with any model out there, right? So you're not, some kind of Olama, which allows you to connect to a Hugging Face and pull models from there. You just create an interface. The interface is currently to online models like, Gemini, Claude you mentioned before, or I can use it also with local models.
Yeah, you can do both. The Agent Client Protocol is agnostic to where the LLM is actually running. I think the initial agents that are coming out, they will just talk to an LLM remotely. But it's entirely possible to configure it to talk to an LLM which is running locally. It's the same protocol from Toad's point of view. It doesn't really matter where the data is coming from. And I reckon that local LLMs are going to start to take over. They're quite difficult to run at the moment because they require quite a lot of CPU and disk space. But computers are getting more powerful all the time, and more of us will have computers which are quite capable of running LLMs, especially when they've got chipsets designed for AI. So I reckon that local LLMs are going to become much bigger in the near future, especially since we've got Chinese companies which are producing very good LLMs that can run locally. But from Toad's point of view, it's completely agnostic to where the agent is actually getting its data from.
Maybe you can walk us through how should I use Toad? I want to start using it. And after all the logistical aspects, downloading it and so on and so forth, I want to use it with Claude, for instance, or with Gemini. How do I set it up? Because definitely I'll need a key to interact with the API, and just walk us through it.
So if you run Claude via Toad, it shares the login details from the Claude app running on the command line by itself. So if you've got that running, you can then use Claude with Toad without having to log in. Other than that, if you want to start from scratch, you don't have Claude on your system, you would run Toad initially, the list of possible agents. You can select an agent and read some more about it. If you like it, you click install, and then it'll install it. It'll run any code to log in. So it might pop up the browser and require you to log in. Then the browser would disappear, and then you can then jump straight into Claude via Toad. So it's almost like an AI app store. It shows you all the possible agents. You click, install, run. If it's already installed, then it's just one click or a button press to jump straight into a conversation view. And from there, it can update your code and do anything that the Claude app could do if it was running by itself. I want it to be effortless. If you ask the developer to copy an API key into a JSON file and copy a file somewhere, they can handle it, but I don't want to have to ask people to do that. I want everything to be done from a nice front end, and it's just completely fast and trouble-free.
So to just summarize, Toad is targeting developers that want to have more from the CLI when interacting with large language models or with agents, regardless of where they actually reside, if they are locally or in a private network or online.
Mm-hmm.
What's still for you to do? As you said, you're targeting to have the first release in December.
Mm-hmm.
What's next afterwards? Are you waiting for feedback, or you still have a couple of boxes to tick?
There's still some things left to implement and bugs to squash. The feature I'm working on at the moment is proving to be quite challenging. Toad can run applications inside Toad. So let's say you want to run htop, the command line tool which shows what your CPU is doing. I'd like the user to be able to just type htop and it would display htop within Toad, and other features as well. So any other command, an editor, if you wanted to write a commit message and you want to use Vim or Nano, etc., I want that to run inside Toad. So in order to get that working, I need to launch a sub-process, which is easy enough, but I need to interpret the information that comes back from that sub-process and emulate a terminal. So I'm emulating a terminal inside a terminal app, and that requires me to properly understand, parse, and execute all these escape sequences embedded. These have kind of come together over many decades by different manufacturers, and they have lots of little edge cases and they have lots of little idiosyncrasies. So it's proved to be quite challenging. I've got good results actually. It's finally starting to come together. You can run most TUIs inside Toad. So that feature is probably a few days away from being merged. Once that's merged, then I think all the features line up. That's almost ready for release. There's a few small things which are missing. Like there's a tree view which displays all your files in your project directory. That doesn't update when you add new files or delete files. So that I need to implement. And then there's lots of other things to clean up and to streamline and test and documentation, all the usual stuff. The work is always ongoing for building software projects. You can rarely say you've finished, but this will be quite a good initial release. It's going to be open source. At the moment, it's in a private repository. But once all the features line up and people can use it without anything breaking, etc., then I'll release it. And I think I'm on target for December. Fingers crossed.
Okay, great. What's the reasoning behind it of trying to run everything? You mentioned that you would like to be able to run other tools inside Toad. What are your concerns? Why would you like to do that? Why not launch another process externally and then just take the output?
You could have two terminals side by side, but I think it's a much more pleasant experience if you just have one terminal. And the interface to Toad is a little unusual in that it feels very much like a shell in itself, as well as a LLM type conversation view. It also has some similarities with a Jupyter notebook, where you've got like a stream of widgets and you can go back and interact with them. So I want it to be a single place where everything just works. If you're working on a TUI, for instance, I want them to be able to run that TUI inside Toad. Or if you just happen to write a shell command and it launches a TUI, I want that TUI to work as it normally would inside a shell. Or if you ask the LLM to run something, I want that thing to run. The other agentic coding tools, if you run an interactive TUI, it would just not exit. It would just show you nothing. It's waiting for data, etc. That is a awful user experience. I just want things to run. If you type it in the prompt and it would run normally in the terminal, then I wouldn't expect it to run in Toad. No compromises. I don't think these agentic coding tools get a pass. If they can't run something because they're running in a sub-process and they can't display the output, that's not good enough. We can do better as developers, and I want the Toad experience to be completely friendly and no surprises.
Okay. Well, best of luck with tinkering.
Thank you.
Is there anything else that I should have asked you, but I failed to ask?
Oh, I guess I'd like people to know how they can try Toad. I have a Discord server, which I created when Textualize was a startup. We don't have a company behind it. It's just myself, but it's a very good place to discuss Rich and Textual and Toad. If you're interested in testing it out when it's released in December, join that Discord server and go to the Toad channel and DM me your GitHub username. And if you do that, we'll be able to play the Toad when it's ready.
Okay, great. Thank you, Will. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.